July 16th, 1945, 5:29 a.m. Trinity Site, New Mexico. A light brighter than 1,000 suns bloomed over the desert, melting the sand into glass and heralding a new, terrifying age. In that silent, searing flash, the seeds of a conflict unlike any other were sown. This would not be a war of massed armies colliding on defined fronts, but a 4-decade-long twilight struggle, a duel of ideas and ideologies fought in the shadow of a weapon that could end the world. The stage was a broken continent. From the ashes of the Second World War, 2 victors emerged, separated by an ocean and an unbridgeable philosophical chasm. In the West stood the United States, scarred but economically vibrant, its democratic traditions and capitalist engine intact. In the East, the Soviet Union, bled white by unimaginable sacrifice, stood as a paranoid, hardened colossus, its communist ideology demanding perpetual expansion as a guarantee of its own security. The first battle lines were not drawn on maps, but in the speeches of statesmen. Winston Churchill's voice echoed across the Atlantic, declaring an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe. From Stettin to Trieste, the continent was cleft in two. The West saw a prison wall, the East saw a necessary barrier against a hostile world. This was the central tragic paradox of the Cold War. Each side's defensive measures were perceived by the other as acts of aggression. The opening salvos were acts of sustenance and subversion. The United States launched the Marshall Plan, a breathtaking act of strategic generosity, pumping billions into Western Europe to rebuild shattered economies and inoculate them against the appeal of communism. Simultaneously, the Soviets tightened their grip, engineering communist takeovers in the nations of Eastern Europe, transforming them into buffer states and client regimes. The first major crisis erupted in Berlin, a city deep inside the Soviet zone, itself divided into sectors. In June 1948, Stalin blockaded the western half, attempting to starve the Allies out. The West responded not with tanks, but with transport planes. For 11 months, the Berlin Airlift became a continuous stream of hope, delivering food and coal, a demonstration of resolve and logistics that forced the Soviets to back down. The city became a permanent symbol of defiance. The abstract struggle now demanded a military frame. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was born in 1949, a defensive pact binding America to the security of Western Europe. In response, the Warsaw Pact would later coalesce. For the first time in history, the world was formally divided into 2 opposing nuclear-armed camps. The doctrine was Mutual Assured Destruction, MAD, a chilling acronym that perfectly captured the logic of the balance of terror. Then, in 1949, the American nuclear monopoly shattered. The Soviet Union detonated its own atomic bomb, built with breathtaking speed thanks to espionage and sheer will. The stakes were instantly, terrifyingly multiplied. The arms race had begun, a frantic, resource-devouring competition where each new bomber, missile or warhead was built in the desperate hope it would never be used. The war turned hot in a land few in the West could find on a map. In June 1950, North Korean troops, backed by Moscow and Beijing, stormed across the 38th parallel. The United Nations, in a rare moment of Soviet absence, authorized a military response. The Korean War became the Cold War's first brutal proxy conflict, a bloody, grinding stalemate that ended not in victory, but in an armistice that persists to this day, a frozen conflict born of the larger freeze. The death of Stalin in 1953 offered a fleeting glimpse of a thaw, but the underlying dynamics remained. The world watched as East Germans rose up in 1953, and later as Hungarians did in 1956, only to be crushed by Soviet tanks. These revolts revealed the grim truth. The Iron Curtain was not just to keep the West out, but to keep their own people in. The battlefield expanded into the cosmos. The 1957 launch of Sputnik was a beeping aluminum sphere that sent a wave of panic through the West. It was not just a scientific achievement, it was a demonstration that Soviet rockets could deliver nuclear warheads across continents. The space race was on, a high-tech public relations war for the allegiance of the developing world. The ultimate symbol of the ideological divide was now a wall. In 1961, the Berlin Wall erupted overnight, a concrete and barbed wire scar through the heart of a city. It was a monstrous admission of failure, a confession that the communist workers' paradise had to cage its citizens to keep them from fleeing. Yet for the West, it became a prison wall they were powerless to tear down without triggering a wider war. In October 1962, the world held its breath. American U-2 spy planes discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. For 13 days, the world teetered on the brink of nuclear annihilation. President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev engaged in a nerve-wracking game of diplomatic chicken, played out against the backdrop of frantic military preparations. The crisis was diffused by a secret deal, American missiles withdrawn from Turkey in exchange for Soviet ones from Cuba. But the lesson was seared into the consciousness of both leaders. The game was too dangerous. A direct hotline was installed between Washington and Moscow, a technological acknowledgement that in the nuclear age miscommunication could mean the end of everything. The shock of the Cuban Missile Crisis gave way to a period of cautious coexistence. The Limited Test Ban Treaty of 1963 was a first small step, curbing the poisonous fallout of atmospheric tests. Détente, a policy of managed rivalry, sought to establish rules for the competition and find areas of mutual interest, such as arms control. Yet the proxy wars continued, burning with a particular ferocity in the jungles of Southeast Asia. The Vietnam War became America's nightmare, a brutal counterinsurgency that drained its treasury, cost tens of thousands of lives, and fractured its society. For the Soviet Union and China, it was a perfect conflict, bleeding their rival without risking a single one of their own soldiers. The policy of détente reached its zenith in the 1970s, with grand presidential summits and the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT. These agreements placed caps on the number of nuclear weapons, an attempt to codify the balance of terror. It was a process of managing the arms race, not ending it, but it created a fragile framework for stability. This stability was always brittle. The 1973 Yom Kippur War saw the superpowers back their respective allies, Israel and the Arab states, bringing them to the brink of confrontation once more. The world watched as US forces went to DEFCON 3, a stark reminder that a regional conflict could escalate with terrifying speed. The facade of détente shattered in 1979 with a double blow. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to prop up a failing communist regime, miring itself in its own Vietnam. In response, the US boycotted the Moscow Olympics and began funneling weapons to the Afghan Mujahideen, creating a conflict that would bleed the USSR for a decade. A new, more confrontational phase began with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. He abandoned the language of accommodation, famously labeling the Soviet Union an evil empire. He unleashed the largest peacetime military build-up in American history, pursuing technologies like the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, a proposed missile shield that threatened to overturn the fragile logic of MAD. The pressure on the Soviet system was now immense. Its command economy, sclerotic and inefficient, could not keep pace with American technological and military spending. While the West entered the digital age, the Soviet Union was plagued by shortages, corruption, and a deep pervasive stagnation. The empire was rotting from within. Then came the catalyst. In 1985, a new younger leader emerged in Moscow, Mikhail Gorbachev. He understood the system was unsustainable. He introduced two revolutionary concepts: glasnost, openness, allowing for unprecedented public criticism, and perestroika, restructuring, a hesitant move toward economic reform. Gorbachev sought to save Soviet communism by making it more humane and efficient. Instead, he unleashed forces he could not control. By loosening the chains of censorship and repression, he allowed the deep-seated grievances of the Soviet Empire's captive nations to surface. The lid was coming off the pressure cooker. The turning point arrived not in a treaty but in a ceremony. In 1987, Reagan stood at the Brandenburg Gate and issued a direct challenge. "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." It was a moment of supreme rhetorical defiance. 2 years later, through a series of bureaucratic missteps and popular pressure, the unthinkable happened. The Berlin Wall was breached by jubilant citizens. The iconic image of the Cold War was destroyed with hammers and dancing. The dam had broken. In 1989, a wave of peaceful revolutions swept across Eastern Europe. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Bulgaria shook off their communist regimes with stunning speed. In Romania, it was more violent, but the outcome was the same. The Iron Curtain, once a seemingly permanent feature of the landscape, was vanishing before the world's eyes. The final act played out within the Soviet Union itself. The Baltic states led the way, declaring their independence. Gorbachev, trying to hold the centre, was caught between hardliners who saw treason and reformers who saw inevitability. The very structure of the state was fracturing. The end came not with a bang, but with a failed putsch. In August 1991, hardline communists, desperate to turn back the clock, placed Gorbachev under house arrest. But they had not counted on the defiance of the Russian people, who rallied around the newly elected president of the Russian Republic, Boris Yeltsin. Standing on a tank outside the Russian parliament, Yeltsin became the symbol of resistance. The coup collapsed in humiliation, but it fatally weakened Gorbachev and the Central Soviet government. The constituent republics, one after another, declared their sovereignty. On December 25, 1991, the red flag with its hammer and sickle was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. Mikhail Gorbachev, the man who had tried to reform the impossible, resigned. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics ceased to exist. The Cold War was over. There was no surrender signed on a battleship, no victory parade through Red Square. The conflict simply evaporated, its foundational state having collapsed from its own internal contradictions. The West was left not with a conquered foe, but with a vast, unstable landscape of new nations and a massive nuclear arsenal in uncertain hands. The cost was incalculable. Trillions of dollars had been spent on weapons that thankfully were never used. Millions had died in proxy wars from Korea to Angola to Afghanistan. An entire generation had grown up under the shadow of the bomb, practicing duck-and-cover drills and living with the subconscious fear of a sudden, global death. The Cold War was a contest of wills, a battle of ideas fought with espionage, propaganda, and economic warfare. It was a struggle between the individual and the collective, between freedom and equality, though both ideals were often betrayed by their champions. Its legacy is a world it shaped. NATO, created to contain the USSR, endured and expanded. The nuclear non-proliferation regime remains a central pillar of global security. The borders of the modern Middle East, the tensions on the Korean Peninsula, and the very architecture of international institutions are all products of this long conflict. The long peace it enforced was a terrifying, unnatural state, a peace guaranteed by the threat of mutual suicide. It prevented a Third World War, but it also froze countless local conflicts in place, leaving them to fester and erupt in its aftermath. In the end, the West did not win the Cold War through military confrontation alone. It was won by the relentless pressure of its economic and ideological appeal, and ultimately by the courage of those behind the Iron Curtain who yearned for freedom. The Soviet Union did not lose. It broke, unable to provide for its people or contain their aspirations. The shadow lifted, but it never fully disappeared. The geopolitical fault lines, the distrust, the nuclear terror, these are the ghosts of the Cold War. They remind us that the world we inhabit was forged in a 40-year twilight, a permanent state of suspended animation that ended not with a conclusive victory, but with the quiet, stunning collapse of an empire that forgot its people.